It's 6 o'clock in London. It's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID live stream, Series 20, Episode 1. That's episode 115 in the aggregate. Starts here. Interesting news from the world of exchanges over the course of the last week. We mentioned in Exchange Invest last week that the FTC under Chairman Lena Khan was under some pressure. Well, ICE have upped the pressure on the whole area of the Black Knight deal. Black Knight have decided to sell Optimal Blue due to merger concerns, and that has promptly caused the FTC to withdraw some of their criticisms of the deal. Watch this space, or at least wait for this space during the course of the summer holidays. Will we get a resolution during August? Who knows, ladies and gentlemen, but it certainly looks more optimistic for ICE getting their deal done. Meanwhile, in Korea, we've got a competition outbreak. The Korean broker technology and think tank funded ATS Nexttrade has been given preliminary approval by the local regulators, the FSC, with competition for the KRX, the monopoly incumbent, is now looming. Meanwhile, the CME, well, they're feeling the pressure of competition. They're going to lay off 3% of their workforce. That's around about 100 jobs are going, following in the footsteps of Wall Street, which has been losing a large amount of headcount during the course of the last year, when obviously there haven't been so many lucrative deals on the go. Speaking of lucrative deals, of course, I've donned my pink shirt today in order to celebrate once again the wonderment of Barbie Week, ladies and gentlemen. It's been definitely a Barbie world as Barbie exploded even more nuclearly than Oppenheimer into the world. Last year, we popped a little bubble in Exchange Invest, which had quite gripped the media at one point, that there was somehow an Anne Hathaway effect on the broader market. It was rather disappointing all round. However, our ace team of researchers, which power Exchange Invest's thinking, donned their finest pink lab coats last week and found some rather fascinating data which suggests, yes, not only is she box office gold right now, but there may even be a Barbie effect in the stock market too. Barbie, we know, already accounts for about 20% of the profits of Mattel, even before the firm moved into the movie business in the course of the last week. And of course, over $377 million worldwide later, just after one weekend, after a fabulous first weekend in the cinemas, Barbie is in the pink in every sense. So looking at the movie, we were pondering the alpha female question. Does Barbie in her movie, guys, add value to Mattel stock? We looked at 38 different data points, not including the news that we had this week about Barbie's box office receipts. And actually, they were very, very interesting, dating all the way back to 2009. Of course, it's only 38 data points, so it's not quite 2 months worth of data in the aggregate. Nonetheless, Barbie movie announcements inspired 22 up days for Mattel stock and 16 down days. By comparison, on the same days, the American benchmark index, the S&P 500, managed 18 days up and 20 days down. The results aren't all that seismic, but if, like me, you've been a professional trader and you know that any little edge will do, when we look at these 38 trading days, Barbie the movie gave us a 3.83% return, where the S&P 500 on the same days managed 1.77. That's quite an edge, more than double in advantage. Barbie, over 200 basis points of return. Gosh, that really does start queuing for more calls into the wonderment and research into the Barbie effect, ladies and gentlemen, because certainly, judging from the way that the cinema has gone, it's looking very much like a Barbie summer, if not indeed a Barbie world right now. And of course, that gives us to queue for more calls following on from other social media that we ran this week. Given her success as an investor, we're long overdue new dolls in the Barbie series to accompany all those wonderful things like Barbie Surgeon, Barbie Astronaut, and so on. Where is Barbie Investor, Barbie Hedge Fund Manager, and similar financial high achievers? Our guest today is Susan Gidel herself, a fabulous female high achiever in markets. The topic is the wondrous interesting, celestial discussion of today. Astrology, the markets, and you. What an apt way to finish our summer season before we take our summer break. Ladies and gentlemen, Susan Abbott Gidel specializes in financial astrological market research, honed from 35 years in the commodity futures business as a journalist and brokerage firm marketing executive. Based in Chicago, she's a regular on the conference circuit for professional astrologers. And in 2018, she published her first book on the topic of financial astrology, but not her first book, Trading in Sync with Commodities, Introducing Astrology to Your Technical Toolbox. Her first book was actually published as long ago as 2000 AD and was all about the wonderful world of stock indexes. Currently, Susan publishes a newsletter, and it's a great read, I can say, ladies and gentlemen. Red Letter Trading Days, alerting traders and investors to important astrological energy. She also writes the weekly Finstrology column at astrology.com. Susan, welcome to the show. That was a long introduction. I'm sorry, but the Barbie effect was so important in our world. We just had to talk about it. Where in the world are you today?
I am in Chicago, on the northwest side of the city, in my nice little historic Chicago bungalow.
How lovely, a historic Chicago bungalow. That's a beautiful area of the city, actually, quite magnificent. And what an incredible history Chicago has as a commodity trading town. I mean, it always blows my mind that they only incorporated the place as a city sometime around about, I think, the middle of the 1830s. And then essentially within a decade, they had the Chicago Board of Trade was born, and the whole commodities market started to become pivotal to the Midwest via Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Thanks to our location in the middle of the country and railroads that sprang up out of Chicago as a main hub and were key to getting grain into Chicago and back out to the East Coast.
Yes, incredible. And of course, at one stage, there was that amazing sort of triangle. You had the Kansas City Board of Trade, you had the Minneapolis Grain Exchange, and then you also had the Chicago exchanges, but ultimately Chicago reigned supreme as the megacity of the age through the 19th century into the 20th century, and indeed in the 21st electronic century and beyond. Let's just say hello to a few guests that have appeared, a few of our wonderful viewers. Hello, Peter Secon. Good evening to you both, he says. Great to see you, Peter. I hope you and Ari are very, very well. Similarly, Lee Ball. Hello, Lee. It's great to see you back again. I hope all is well in your world too. Good evening, all, he says. John T. Hey, John, it's really, really good to have you watching the show. Thank you very much for joining us in this summer evening. Good to see you. Good evening, everyone, says John T. Aunt Mary is saying good evening. All great to see you, Mary. I'm glad you could see our Barbie effect writ large. That's such a vital and fascinating issue to discuss today. So, Susan, tell me, were you actually born in Chicago?
No, I grew up on a farm about 140 miles straight west of Chicago, 5 miles from the Mississippi River, and a family farm that my ancestors bought in 1848. And I was the 6th generation to live on the farm and grow up there. And we raised when I was there, mainly corn and cattle. So
very interesting.
Come from a farm background.
You come from a big farming background. How appropriate. And 1848 is quite the date. Sorry to speak over you, but 1848, of course, notable. It's the foundation of the Chicago Board of Trade. It's the 1848 revolution in France, amongst other places. But of course, what people forget is the thing that was broadly driving a lot of the upheaval in continental Europe at that time was that it was the last time there was actually a major food blight that was caused by a failure of crops, per se, as opposed to war or something else, on the continent of Europe.
Oh, really?
Quite incredible. Yeah, quite an epic year all round with the foundation of the Board of Trade and everything else. So, Susan, what brought you into the big smoke, and how did you get into the financial business?
Well, it was partly because of where I grew up and what we did. My dad would in the summer come into the house every day for lunch, and that my sister and I were in charge of preparing while my mom was at work. And he would, whatever we were watching on TV, we had to switch right away and couldn't miss the 12:15 news broadcast about what the price of corn was doing at the Chicago Board of Trade that day. And it just fascinated me that he needed to know that every day. And what could possibly make things change one day to another, that this was so important. And so I have always been fascinated with what makes prices move. And so as a result, I went to the University of Illinois, studied ag econ, ag journalism, and ultimately got my first job with a trade magazine, Futures now, but Commodities magazine when I first started.
Futures magazine, Commodities magazine, indeed, as it then was. I must say that takes you back, I mean, quite a way in the developmental cycle of what's gone on in this amazing world. And it's difficult to recall that before there were financial futures and before there were stock indices and so on, all people were talking about in the pits of Chicago at the CME and the Board of Trade was the grains and all of the other commodities.
Soybeans was the biggest market there was when I started at the magazine, and quickly overtaken by bonds because that was in the late 70s. But I was there when we had to make the change to the name of the magazine, and if I remember right, it was 83, to futures, to be more, under the fold of all the financial instruments that were trading and taking over the popularity of the commodities markets. Now, that said, when in the fast forward to the beginning decade of the current century, when I was marketing director at Lind Waldock, which was a retail FCM, it was clear to me that the people we were targeting considered anything that was a futures market as commodities.
Yeah. That's quite funny. Now, Lind Waldock, that's an interesting story, because I remember they were really the first discount, as they then were, futures broker to come to Europe. And I remember them coming to London. And that was quite seismic because, wow, that was in the early 1990s. And in the late 80s, I do believe, I remember being on the floor. And as a floor broker, we could have been charging $21, $22 to people to execute, as they then were life treasury bonds and life euro dollars. And by the time Lind Waldock hit the business in the early 1990s, they were offering the same kind of price to retail. And that was pretty seismic.
Yeah. And
then you think about today, and interactive brokers are offering you pretty much, you can do more or less whatever you want for about $2, I think, if I remember correctly. It's just incredible the way commissions have fallen.
It is. And it was difficult to be in the brokerage business then when interest rates were low, because, a lot of the revenue for an FCM came from interest on customer accounts that weren't in T-bills.
Yeah, and I mean, that was obviously one great thing particularly for Lind when they came to Europe, was they based themselves out of London, where a lot of people were depositing pounds, and that gave you a gorgeous haircut, because UK interest rates were standardly priced off something like 10% at that point in time during the course of the 1990s, which is enough to give probably any millennial mortgagee who's watching this at the moment, they're now having to have insta therapy at the idea that they think that 4.69 or 5.6% mortgage they've got, that they've just gone up to, is pretty much the end of the world. And it's like, what? You ain't seen nothing yet compared to historical averages. It's just incredible. For those of us who've been through a few cycles, it's quite incredible. So you worked at Lind Waldock, and I think actually that's where we first encountered each other, I do believe, sometime during your great and illustrious PR career. And then tell me, I mean, how did your astrological side develop?
Well, I'd always kind of been interested in astrology. And before I was at Lind, I was working with a friend of mine, and we were both also kind of just interested in astrology enough that we would just read the horoscope in the newspaper and pay special attention to our birthday horoscope. But we were about to put up a new website pretty early on in 95. And I happened to see an article in Chicago Magazine about an astrologer here in town who helped businesses pick dates to start things. And so I said, oh, we should go. I should go and have her help us pick a start date for this website. And so I did. And I just kept going. She picked a great date and time for us to launch our website. I say that because a few years later, ultimately, it was mine to sell. And I did. I sold the website for, I thought, a tidy sum. And so I figured that was pretty good. And so I just kept going to see Barbara. Her name is Barbara Shermer. She's has transitioned now. But I saw her for good 19, 20 years. And she's the one. And we often focused on, career business kinds of things.
Very interesting. So from there, presumably you started to think, well, there are a lot of dates in this futures business. Could be that something might be interesting to analyze.
Well, not only that, but when I was at the magazine, I'd interviewed a couple of financial astrologers, and it had in the back of my mind that, okay, people use astrology to trade. I don't know how, but it must do something. So I just kind of started putting the two together and watching them.
Wonderful. So not wishing to put you overly on the spot with the fabulously broadest question of the evening, how do you trade with astrology?
Well, you start from the premise that markets have birthdays like people do. And so whenever they started trading is when they were born. And so if you have that accurate date, time, place, then you can construct a horoscope, a natal horoscope chart or first trade chart. I use the words interchangeably. And then apply any kind of astrological technique that you would with a person. Personally, I watch transits, which means that I'm watching how the planets in the sky are going around the natal chart and then clicking in like a clock, like clock gears, and when there's lots of things going on and they all click at once, something happens. And it's certainly art more than science at this point, but I'm hopeful that AI at some point will take the burden off of me trying to analyze it and be able to see what I am unable to see.
So there's an element of big data. I mean, with so many moving parts to the solar system, you're saying that there's a lot of numbers could be crunched potentially.
Oh, absolutely. And aspects and by degrees and how fast they're moving and do they come back again in retrograde? So, but across all the markets, I mean, what's pretty typical is, and this is after checking, and what I'm looking for when I analyze a market from the beginning, I take a monthly chart and I find the days of significant highs and lows on a monthly chart. And because I'm thinking, okay, well, what's really important for me is, or anybody who's trading, when's it over? When's it starting? And there's similarities at market turns in what the planets are doing in relationship to the first trade chart. No doubt.
That's really interesting. But I suppose then that raises the question, is it difficult to find the day that all markets were born?
Yes.
Okay.
Not so much on the stock side, but in the commodity world, yes. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you have probably been to some of them. There were lots and lots and lots of new markets started in the 80s. And there were pre-opening breakfasts and talks by important people before there was an official bell ringing, that sort of thing. And so, and different times across all exchanges and all markets.
Right.
The New York Stock Exchange has opened at 2 different times in more than 140 years.
Okay.
10 o'clock or 9:30.
Wow.
Commodities exchanges, there's no rhyme or reason. It's all by market, not by exchange.
Right.
And
we've also seen incredible volatility in those times over the course of decades. I mean, okay, things like beans and so on, they managed those classic commodities. They all stuck to their sort of 4-hour trading day until the very last minute. But I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, I can remember Treasury bonds used to open at 2 o'clock London time, and then they brought them to 1:20 London time. So they'd be 10 minutes before the 7:30 a.m. US numbers. And that was, or Chicago numbers. And
but I would use the 8 o'clock.
Yeah. You'd use it. Well, obviously, because that was the time the contract was originally born.
Right.
And I mean, stupid question. This is sort of very nerdy. I'm going to get to a great question coming in from Mick Santos. I'm going to go to that in just a second. But what is the impact if a contract changes? Is that a new contract? I mean, let's take an example. For instance, we've had a lot of bond contracts over time where they've changed the coupon on the bond future. Does that create a new birth chart, or how does that work?
Technically, it does, but I have never paid attention to them.
Okay.
I just stick with the original one as best I can. Now, I know that in the stock market, for example, and this isn't necessarily first trade data, but on an incorporation basis, Silicon Valley Bank earlier this year went bankrupt. And I was looking at the chart. You know, you typically, astrologers are like, whenever there's something big, it's like, oh, look at the chart, what was going on. And so I was looking at the Silicon Valley Bank incorporation chart and its bankruptcy, and there was like no connection with the date I had for when it was incorporated in Delaware, I think. And so I thought, okay, well, there's got to be another one then. And so I found it in California, and bingo. It was exactly the right chart that was reflecting what was going on.
Wow.
So
actually, that's an interesting point. So one further minutiae follow-up, and then we'll get to Mick Santos' question. So with a company, you look at the incorporation date of the company when it's actually born. What impact does the day on which it goes to the stock market and starts its trading, does that have a major impact on the analysis, or is it all about the actual incorporation day?
They're 2 separate things. Okay. I think the incorporation chart tells you, and transits to it, gives you fundamental information in, trader lingo. It's about earnings and executive hires and new product launches and stuff like that. And the first trade chart tells you about price.
Right.
And so for a company, it's fundamentals versus technicals, in my opinion, the incorporation chart versus the price chart.
It's interesting. I just, something has sprung to my mind, which was, I remember reading many years ago, someone who believed that actually a lot of key investors used to keep their dates of birth private because they believed that otherwise astrologers would use it to try and second guess what they were doing. And this was one of the reasons that, this was a reason that was posited for why we never heard exactly what was, I think, the date of birth of George Soros, amongst others. And I always got the impression that actually George Soros, by the time he became super famous, was already well into his 60s. So he probably was quite keen, actually, for everybody to not really know what age he was, rather than it having an astrological bent. But I just mention that as an aside as we're going along, because it's interesting how a lot of, well, I mean, it's trading. Paranoia is kind of part of the game, isn't it? One of those things. So let's go out to, let's go out to a macro pointer, come out from where I've been looking very close. Mick Santos. Hi, Mick. Great to see you. What are the connections of luck and your astrological sign in business? How are they connected?
Well, the sign of luck mainly is Jupiter, that astrologers call the cosmic Santa Claus. And Jupiter is the largest planet in the solar system, and Jupiter would like to give us everything, as much as we want, more than we could possibly imagine. And so wherever Jupiter is in your chart, and that depends, can give clues to the amount of luck you might have in life and with your business. And same thing, for example, even this afternoon, I've got a client that wanted me to take a look at her, not only her natal chart, but her business chart. And so where Jupiter is in each chart and how they connect is important. Better if Jupiter is in its ruling sign of Sagittarius or its traditional sign of Pisces. And better if it is in any of the wealth houses, particularly the second house of income. It's nice to have, if you have Jupiter ruling the second house and Jupiter in the second house, that's a pretty good indication that you probably won't have many money problems.
Interesting. Very interesting altogether. Okay, so we go back to the world. Thank you very much, Mick Santos. A great question. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've got a question for Susan, we're here. We're talking about astrology, the markets, and you. So that does mean you, ladies and gentlemen. If you've got a question, do please send us a bit of love in the meantime on the way through, because, I don't know whether I don't know what the astrological birth signs are of artificial intelligence bots that run around and decide what things get to the top of YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn in terms of videos. So therefore, let's give it a hand. Give us a little bit of a love, a heart, something like that. And that will push Susan's video up in the charts and hopefully be watched by more and more people, so we can talk about this fascinating topic of astrology, the markets, and you. So Susan, as we're looking at markets, you've got this birth date. So therefore, presumably specific contracts, say, of the modern age are relatively easy to understand. But if you've got, say, a stock index, which is the more important then? Is it the first date that they say they calculated that index, because sometimes they regress all the way back umpteen decades? Or is it actually the first day it trades, as, for example, a future or something, which is most important?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was working on my book in 2017, I had every intention. I wanted to focus on the largest market in each of the 6 big commodity sectors, and the stock indexes, it was the S&P 500. And I had every intention that I was going to follow either the big S&P or the E-mini.
Right.
Either one. And but once again, I went back to that monthly price chart and checked transits against the natal charts that I had for the both futures contracts. And it just didn't look or feel right or seem significant. And so I went back to the start of the index in 1957, if I'm remembering it off the top of my head right.
I think you're close enough, yeah.
And that's where it all clicked in. So for sure, with the stock indexes, I just used the start of the index when it was first calculated and first started being calculated live.
Right. Interesting. No, it's fascinating, because it raises so many questions in the minutiae that we have when we go through this. I'm afraid, being pedantic. Now, Fritz George Sawyer. Hello, Fritz George. It's lovely to see you today. We have Venus retrograde now. Ooh, there's a bit of interesting technical lingo for the astrological amongst us. Do we have some changes in QQQ or SPY?
Hi, Fritz. Yes. Venus retrograde that started last Saturday typically is bearish for the U.S. stock market. And so I'm kind of looking for prices for a general decline of somewhat, maybe around 10%-ish, by the time it turns direct again at Labor Day weekend.
Interesting. So it's a kind of a retrograde move that's a little bit in line with the old English adage of sell in May and go away. It's slightly later, but nonetheless, the idea that you'd have a slight turn down in summer. So just explain something for the totally ignorant amongst us like me. What exactly does that mean when you talk about something being retrograde?
Well, for example, Venus retrograde. Obviously, all the planets are out there in the sky and they're all we're all rotating around the sun, but at different speeds, depending on how far or how close they are to the sun. And so from Earth, sometimes it appears to us from our vantage point that these planets have turned around and are moving backwards, which is what the retrograde means.
Okay.
That to us from Earth, it looks in the sky like it's going backwards, but it's not.
See, it's simply do our thing. And of course, I mean, that's a general criticism that's leveled at astrology, is that people say, oh, it's all a two-dimensional vision of what's happening. But essentially, that's just the snapshot then of what people see on Earth rather than the holistic picture.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's a good thing to remember, is that when you look at a horoscope on a piece of paper, it's a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional picture that has we're in the middle here in the Earth, and there were planets above us and to the side and below us when we were born in 3 dimensions.
So for the traders amongst us, if you learned your options of those two-dimensional diagrams that they used to draw on whiteboards around the world, you'll understand what it's like when you've got a 3-dimensional world explode around you. It's somewhat similar.
Well, and was always my bane of existence about options trading. To me, it was like playing 3-dimensional chess. It's like, whoa.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and everybody just drew these simple things. It's like, it's a line. That's what it does. And it's, yes, it's a kind of, yeah. But the bit between here and expiration, yes, you might find that you have remarkably gray hair, if you have any hair whatsoever, depending on what you've done in the meantime. Yeah. And I suppose astrology probably does similar things. Just thank you very much, Fritz George Sawyer, for your question. Really, really appreciate it. Glad you could engage with us today. So as we're building this holistic picture of markets and astrology and so on, where do you kick in? I mean, how does astrology specifically help us in business and finance?
Well, I think astrology is the ultimate timing tool, because I've got a book sitting over here that can tell me the exact location by sign and degree of every planet for the next 50 years. And with that, in the ephemeris, you can see how the planets in the sky are relating to each other, and they have their own relationships. And then once you know that, then you can apply that to how those relationships are affecting your first trade charts that you're watching. So it's all about timing. And I think that there's so few technical analysis tools that are good with time that I think astrology is helpful from a trading perspective to understand what's happening in the sky. And then for one, that is just general and can affect anybody who is trading, affects all of us equally. And then the second deeper layer is to see how what's happening in the sky is relating specifically to the markets you might be trading. I don't know of a technical analysis tool that could do it better.
That's very interesting. So in other words, it's an additional technical analysis tool, you perceive it as, within your toolbox, that you can use all these other indicators, whatever it is that you decide to pick from the cornucopia of the Encyclopedia of Technical Analysis, and this can line up alongside it.
Yeah,
very interesting.
I think so. And truly, I don't want people to think that astrology is like the be all end all holy grail thing. I don't. I want you to just throw it in the mix if it's interesting to you and is valuable. And like any trading strategy that you might have, what you really want to see all those indicators come together all at once. And so same deal with astrology. If I'm saying, okay, well, I think the S&P is going to make a high next Wednesday, and you're seeing the other things that you're watching support that, well, cool.
Interesting. And I mean, on the macro, I was struck by something the other week, because just last week I saw Nora Danuzzo, who'd been a guest on my wife Beata's Woman on It PhD live stream just a few weeks ago. And she actually made a comment about this Mercury retrograde, because her instant comment was, whoa, Mercury's gone retrograde. Does everybody start feeling much better all of a sudden? I know everything in my office suddenly seems to be so much improved. And I was curious about that. I thought it was very interesting as I was reading. I'm not cynical, not casting shade, just genuinely curious, because it hadn't really occurred to me that these sorts of things could really make such a major impact upon us.
Well, Mercury retrograde in particular, because it goes retrograde 3 times a year, 3 weeks at a time. So, and Mercury rules communications, it rules phones, internet, computer, trading, stock indexes. So it has a Mercury retrograde has a big overall general effect on the markets from that point of view. I encourage people to, during a Mercury retrograde, double check your orders, beware of fat finger trades, check your statements. Anything that could possibly go wrong with trading might during a Mercury retrograde. And in fact, as tiny and inexperienced trader that I am, I have, one of my trading rules is to not trade during a Mercury retrograde, because I had a stop. It got blown through, not executed, when Mercury was retrograde. And I'm like, okay, I'm out. I'm just not doing this anymore.
That's interesting. We've got a wild stack of questions coming up, but I will actually say one thing, which is when I traded day in, day out full time, I must admit, I never traded on full moon days. And the reason for that wasn't because I particularly made money or lost money, but it just felt like I was going through the ringer. I mean, it was like I was trying to trade while simultaneously fighting my way through the Burmese forest in the middle of the most humid rainy season or something. It was exhausting. And I found it most unpleasant. And I actually found out a lot more energy if I just went off and did something completely different on a full moon day, and then came back and traded. I could trade the day before, I could trade the day after, and it never had the same degree of impact on me.
Yeah. And I would suggest that you very well might have a full moon in your birth chart, that you were born under a full moon, because people with that configuration often are very sensitive to the full moon.
Interesting. That's very, very interesting indeed, Susan. Thank you very much. So we're talking about markets, astrology, and you. I know you got some charts also you're going to throw into the mix as we go through here, and you're very welcome to do so. But let's go to a couple of these questions, because actually we got a load of fascinating questions. First up, we've got Tisha Morris. Hello, Tisha. It's lovely to see you on the show. Do you think the new nodal axis will affect the markets?
Well, in the big scheme of things, yes. We have, if you're familiar with the McWhorter cycle, that suggests that with the nodes moving further toward an economic low, when they hit Aquarius, when the North Node hits Aquarius, it just moved into Taurus. Yes. So we're in the decline economically, fully at this point, by virtue of the move by the nodes just in the last few days or so, week, something like that.
Okay, so sorry, fill that in for me a bit, because I'm afraid the new nodal axis sounds to me like a punk rock band. So I'm terribly sorry that I may not be completely au fait with that, and perhaps you can explain to us a little bit so that we can slightly understand that better, Susan, if it's possible.
Sure. The nodal axis is the points there. It's the lunar nodes, and there's a north node and a south node. They're exactly opposite all the time, and they represent the intersection between the moon and the ecliptic. It's getting a little technical, but at any rate, they move backwards, and they are in one axis set of signs for about 18 months. And let's see here, it just moved into, they just left Taurus, sorry. The North Node just entered Aries on July 18.
Okay.
I'm checking my ephemeris here. And just significant in a way that, once again, the McWhorter cycle developed about 100 years ago
Mm-hmm.
suggests that in particular, the U.S. economy peaks when the North Node is in Leo, and that the U.S. economy reaches its depth of decline with the North Node in Aquarius.
Fascinating. Very interesting. I'm going to go off and read more about the McWhirter cycle. That's one cycle that has passed me by so far. Thank you very much, Tisha Morris, for that question. Very, very interesting. Mick Santos is back again. Are there any specific lucky astrological signs for a specific business?
Yes. And I would say if you're going to start a business, you would like to have the sun in the sign that is associated with that business. For example, just off the top of my head, if you were going to start a gold mining company, you would like to have the sun in Leo, because Leo rules gold.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, so that's something useful we can all go and presumably Google and read up a bit more about. And actually, then John T, hi John again, building on a similar sort of topic, thank you, Mick Santos, are there any zodiac signs that may lend individuals to become more successful investors?
Once again, a good Jupiter would help. And I think, and there's another hint in charts, the asteroid Vesta. Mm-hmm. And I learned this from the financial astrologer Christine Skinner in London. She calls it the trader's asteroid. And where that is in your chart could be significant. If it's in the 5th house, that would be helpful. That's the house of speculation. But more importantly, what you see is, and what she's seen over the years, and she's seen way more than I have, that Vesta conjunct any of the cusps of the 1st, 4th, 7th, or 10th houses, what we call the angles, indicates that you could very well have a natural talent for trading.
Fascinating. Really fascinating altogether. Thank you very much, John T. Well, I'm going to allow you to take a quick rest there for a moment, Susan, because you've been giving us so much information. And let's move to one of the things we always introduce at the moment in this series, our book of the week. It's not about financial astrology this week. The book of the week we're looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is from one of our previous guests, Alessandro Hatami, and it's called Reinventing Banking and Finance. Reinventing Banking and Finance is given the subtitle Frameworks to Navigate Global FinTech Innovation, and it provides a thorough overview of the global FinTech ecosystem and the drivers behind innovation in technologies, business models, and distribution channels. Example of key institutions, interviews with innovators and experts, shining a light on key financial innovation hubs across the world, covering genuine innovations in AI, machine learning, blockchain, and digital identity. And indeed, as you may recall, Alessandro's co-author was actually a great guest on PhD at my wife's live stream a few months ago. And we're looking forward to her also joining us in the near future, sometime hopefully during the course of the autumn, winter, or indeed fall, winter, spring of next year, or at least the rest of this year after we take our August break. Don't forget, if you're missing IPO-VID during the course of August, ladies and gentlemen, you can always check out our videos. They're all online on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, depending on where you're watching this. Look out for IPO-VID. You can search and look through an archive of 115 fascinating interviews over the course of the last few years. And if that's not enough for you, don't forget, we've got a weekly podcast, Exchange Invest Weekly Podcast, which is 15 minutes roughly, give or take, which are the highlights of what's going on in the exchange world, and it's absolutely free. There's also our weekend newsletter, which is also absolutely free. You can sign up for that at exchangeinvest.com. And then when you want to go hardcore, when you really need to be at the water cooler of the bourse business, the exchange of information itself, the Exchange Invest Daily Newsletter, the newsletter of the bourse business, as read by the leading figures in the industry, with my own inveterate pith therein. You can also sign up to Exchange Invest via exchangeinvest.com, where we've got our magnificent new beta site, and you will gain access to all of the previous archive of over 2,700 issues dating back more than 10 years. Now, back to the wonderment of this astrological discussion we're having today. Astrology, the Markets, and You with Susan Abbott Gidel, an expert in the field. So, Susan, I mean, tell us something about, I mean, the macro at the moment. We talked about this retrograde Mercury. I mean, that's something, but what are the really, really big things that are going on in terms of astrology that we should know about and how they're impacting on finance?
Well, I do have a cool chart here. For those in the back room, it is chart number 3. The Dow and the Saturn-Uranus cycle from 1988 to 2032. This is the Venus retrograde as we're going by it. That one. Oops, back up. Oh, now go forward again. That one. Okay. So I've studied the Dow Jones Industrial Average versus the Saturn-Uranus cycle because they both began within 6 months of each other. The Dow Jones Industrial Average got its start in May of 1896, and the Saturn-Uranus cycle, which is defined by conjunction to conjunction over the course of 45 years, started in January of 1897. And so it's nice to see how the Saturn-Uranus cycle, which Saturn represents the status quo, Uranus represents change, and the two planets connect regularly to move us forward, to keep stability, but to make change, without blowing things up. And so the Saturn-Uranus cycle is the longest one that financial astrologers watch, particularly as it concerns markets. And the picture here is the current cycle that we're in, the third since the Dow was started in 1896. And the latest one began in 1988 and will conclude at the next conjunction in 2032. And so from a macro sense, and admittedly, this is only the third one, so I know that, there's only 3 sets of data to watch, but they've been consistent throughout. And the consistency is that the Dow bottoms at the conjunction on the left-hand side of your screen. It makes a record high at the first square when they are 90 degrees apart. And that's that first arrow on the left you see.
Mm-hmm.
They make another record high at the opposition, another hard aspect. That's the second arrow. And that one was a little early. That Saturn-Uranus opposition, or the high was in 07, and the opposition happened actually about the time of the depth of the financial crisis in the fall of 08. So that was a little early, but still there was a record high near that Saturn-Uranus opposition. And then the third one, the final hard aspect in the cycle is the final square, which just concluded in December. Let's see, December here. Let me find my cheat sheet things where I have the boot here. There were 3 connections of Saturn square Uranus throughout 2021. The last one was on December 24, 2021. Mm-hmm. And the Dow made its record high on January 5, 2022, not 10 days later. And so what I expect to see based on previous cycles is that there will be a correction from this record high toward the Saturn sextile Uranus aspects that begin in spring of 25, the purple lines that you see next in line there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm expecting the Dow to, by the time it hits those purple lines, to be at to have tested one of the 3 red lines, horizontal ones. The first one is about 26,000 on the Dow. That would be about a 30% decline, which would be equal to the similar phase decline astrologically in the second cycle. 18,000 Dow would be the COVID low, about 50%. which just seems like, okay, well, that's could be reasonable to test. And then the final one at the very bottom is at 4,000 Dow. If you think that we're going through 1929, 1932 kind of depression between now and then.
Wow. Yeah. I think certainly if we see 4,000, I think a lot of people are going to be in the mountains outside of, whether it's mountains outside New York or the mountains outside of London, probably knitting their own sweaters and trading cans of beans by that stage. It seems quite incredible to think.
Well, exactly. And, and does it seem likely? No. But did it seem likely in 1929? Probably not.
No. And it didn't seem terribly likely that the world's governments would decide that we all had to stay in our homes for 2 years either at some point in time recent. I'm not arguing whether that's right or wrong, folks, just saying it did not seem plausible. Yeah.
Right. And so you don't know. So I'm just saying, okay, this has happened in the past in this cycle.
Could be. Yeah, that's quite incredible. That's fascinating. Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
Those are fascinating macro topics. Gosh, we could talk about so much here, but I'm going to move on to, we've got a couple of questions I'm going to take before we wrap up the show here. Now, I must apologize because I'm dealing with very small type here and I do not have the world's most acute eyesight. So if I pronounce the following two names wrongly, I apologize in advance. I think this Congereque or Congerec, when looking at an underlier's chart, stock, etc., overlaid with a current chart, are there specific planets aspects to observe, or is that all that needs to be analyzed?
Good question. Thank you. And I would say that you really have to see how your market responds to transits to its first trade chart. Because there are some markets where you don't think a planet is going to be important, but it turns out to be. Generally, it is the planets in the natal chart, in the first trade chart, that are important to watch are the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars. And by transit, same deal. It is the faster, those 5 faster moving planets that typically are the trigger to a formation, but it is helped by, for example, if one of the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, but particularly Jupiter and Saturn, are also around there at the same time. So it depends, but I would say focus on, start looking at the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the intersection there, Congreg. I hope that helps. Thank you very, very much for your question. Fascinating questions we're getting today, and probably going to be our last question from the audience for today because we're running short on time. Like Sonne Blumensat, is there any general placement to avoid or be aware of when starting a business or when trading?
To avoid, yes, I wouldn't start a business. I would try to start a business with as many planets direct in motion as possible. You can't avoid it often with Jupiter out through Pluto because they can be retrograde for months at a time. But if you can, good. And probably particularly, I would avoid starting a business with Mercury retrograde, which portends potential ongoing issues with contracts, communications, that sort of thing, or Venus retrograde, which portends potential financial difficulties for the company. And when trading, once again, I think you have to be on your toes when Mercury is retrograde. Just in the air, generally. For yourself, you'd probably have to look at your own transits to see when you have great times to trade. Once again, you would want to see Jupiter in some nice setup that says, ooh, you are really on point. And you would like to see Mercury, the brains and the thinking and the analyzing in good shape for trading.
Fascinating. Really fascinating altogether. So at this point, we've only got about 5 or 6 minutes to run. I think we have answered all of the questions that we have in at the moment, ladies and gentlemen, that I can see. Thank you very, very much for those. Let me therefore move, Susan, to the question we ask everybody. Susan Gidel, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
I think it goes toward what I call the air economy, and that would be to our technical helpers, chart number 6, the NASDAQ 100 and the Jupiter-Saturn 2020 conjunction. And we'll see where we go here. Oh, this is where I think the Dow could potentially go.
Right. Very interesting.
There it is. So Jupiter and Saturn have a 20-year cycle, and so much shorter than the Saturn-Uranus, and they make conjunctions with each other every 20 years. And since the 1842, they have been making conjunctions in Earth signs. So the economy, which they represent, expansion, contraction, Jupiter's expansion, Saturn's contraction. So they have a connection to the business cycle worldwide. And since the mid-1800s, they've been making conjunctions in Earth signs. So that says that the economy valued things of Earth, stuff, physical stuff that we could touch and hold and feel. On December 21, 2020, Jupiter and Saturn made a conjunction in Aquarius, at 0 Aquarius, the very first sign of the first degree of the sign. And for the next 199 years, Jupiter and Saturn will make conjunctions in air signs. And so now the economy will value things of air. And let me find my cheat sheet. Here we go. And so the air signs are Gemini, which would value things of ideas, communication, Libra, cooperation and justice, and Aquarius, technology, independence, global community, humanity, and astrology. So I think over the next 200 years, we're shifting into an economy that will value air ideals. So we as a society, and as represented by the companies that will do well to support what we as a society want, will have elements of air associated with them. So for example, online learning, air, wind turbines for energy, things like that. Artificial intelligence for sure. And this chart, it connects the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in 2020 with the NASDAQ 100 natal Mercury at 0 Aquarius. And so personally, I think ultimately the NASDAQ 100 could become the institutional benchmark as we go through this. And because the conjunction, it absolutely conjunct the NASDAQ's natal Mercury, which rules trading and stock indexes. Now, we had a little preview. If what you want to know about the air economy, we had a preview from 1980 to 2000 when they were conjunct in Libra before they went back for one more time in Earth. And so if you remember 1980 through 2000, computers, cell phones, online trading, and that's just the beginning. The internet is barely an adult at this point from an astrological standpoint. And so, but we're at the very, very beginning. If this were a baseball game, we'd be in the top of the first right now. The first batter at the plate with a count of maybe 2-2. That's how early this is.
Wow.
But so that's where I see it going.
Fascinating. So for those of you who don't understand baseball, it's a bit like cricket, except you're not likely to lose 2 days through rain and therefore end up with the game not going anywhere. So that, I think, is a fabulous analogy that you've ended on, actually, Susan. It's been really, really interesting. 2 mic drops. I mean, talking about this age of air, I think is absolutely intriguing. Second of all, I mean, the one that really I took away was astrology is the ultimate timing tool. And if that hasn't made your last hour worthwhile, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what has. This has been a fantastic show to end before we go for our 1-month summer break. Thank you very, very much to Susan Gidel for your fantastic contribution today, talking about astrology, the markets, and you. We're coming back with a cracking first guest. It's a returning guest, Rainer Zittelmann, the Wealth Elite. We're going to be talking about that on the 12th of September. We'll be back after US Labor Day, same time, same place, as always, across Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Let me just say a huge thank you to all of the people who contributed today. Fabulous to see so much engagement. Thank you very much. Peter Secon, Lee Ball, John T, Mary, Mick Santos, Fritz George Sawyer, Tisha Morris, Kongera Kwe, and I do believe there was also Ms. Like Sane. Thank you very, very much, one and all, for your contributions. Let me say thank you to our fantastic production team today. Really, really good work by Jamil, Rushlin, and Fernando. My name is Patrick L. Young. I want to wish you all a fantastic remaining Mercury in retrograde. We'll be back once that's all over, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks again to our fabulous guest today, Susan Abbott Gidel. And don't forget, if you're missing us, check us out on the archives on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, or alternatively, join us at exchangeinvest.com. We'll be publishing every day of the week during the course of the August holidays, as well as, of course, on Saturdays too. My name is Patrick L. Young. I wish you all a great week in life and markets, whether you're retrograde or not, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a super show. Thank you once again, Susan Abbott Gidel. Have a great summer. See you in September. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you.